Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk about the role of pragmatics and pleasure in effective harm reduction. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this, but basically in brief, I'm going to talk about some findings from the Stay and Safe study and how they showed us that the motivations for people to use safely were most often related to pleasures and pragmatics than long-term fears about catching bloodborne viruses. Okay, so this is just a brief research history. Not all of my projects are in there, but just to show that I've been basically working on Hep C related issues for over 10 years. And the project I'm going to draw on today is the Stay and Safe study, which explored the social practices of people who injected drugs who had managed to avoid hepatitis C. And here we concentrated on people who'd been injecting for over 7 years, because about 70% of these people have got Hep C. So it was like, what are these people doing that are right? Now, why am I so interested in hepatitis C? It's a bit of a passion of mine. Well, firstly, it's highly prevalent, so we've got approximately 214,000 people with chronic Hep C in the UK. It predominantly affects marginalised communities. As you all know, 90% of new infections amongst people who inject drugs. It's silent, stigmatised and marginalised, much more so than HIV. We've got few celebrity endorsements. There's minimal perceived threat to the wider community of hepatitis C. Also, hepatitis C is a very personal subject for me. I used to be a user. I injected daily for about 10 years. During that time I got Hep C, eventually went through treatment for it. And my experiences of stigma, confusions around disclosure, whether to go on treatment, basically motivated my research trajectory. Also, Hep C is really interesting because it's a harm reduction challenge. Current interventions aren't impacting massively upon the incidence and prevalence of Hep C amongst the community. And there's evidence that risk awareness alone is insufficient to affect a change in injecting risk behaviour. So why might this be? Well, here are the sort of messages we're getting around hepatitis C. These are the basic harm reduction messaging, which they're risk focused, they're exhorting people not to share. Don't share needles, you might get hepatitis C. Don't share a bloody thing. If you share your drugs, don't share your blood, etc. And hepatitis C harm reduction came out under the umbrella of HIV harm reduction. And in the early days of HIV harm reduction, as you'll probably remember, it was very fear and risk based, around messages around the Grim Reaper, for example. And here you can see an example of this up there with the needle with the death head on top. Don't share needles, don't get stuck with AIDS. And I see that Hep C messaging is still focused along these lines. I mean, it's not as heavy here as the Grim Reaper stuff, but it's still exhortations not to share, risk and fear based. So why might not this be working? Does a risk emphasis speak to the reality of everyday's lives? Well, qualitative research has shown that Hep C is perceived as ubiquitous, normalised. It's an occupational hazard for many people who are injecting drugs. People feel that it's hard to avoid, that they're going to end up getting it. It's just part of the deal of being an injecting drug user. So as Roz here from the Stay and Safe study says, I first heard of Hep C just a few years ago. My mate said, you're bound to get it. Everyone who injects has got Hep C. And I thought, you can't die from it, can you? It didn't really bother me. So this perception of hepatitis C as being everywhere, has been hard to avoid, has led amongst some people to a fatalism and a prevention fatigue, particularly around hepatitis C risk-based messaging. So as Leroy here says, my philosophy is, if you're going to get something, you're going to get it. You know, that's my philosophy. It's true. If you're going to get something, you're going to get something. So do hepatitis C harm reduction messages that emphasise risk speak to these people? My guess is that they don't really. So there's time for a new approach. And traditional Hep C prevention research has been very much focused on the event, on the risk event, on what people are doing wrong, how they're managing to get hepatitis C, looking at transmission risk. And this invariably leads to findings that emphasise deficits in risk knowledge, deficits in concern, which can perpetuate stereotypes of people who inject drugs as not really that interested in their health. And this then leads to risk awareness-based messaging. Now, the Stay Safe study, which I conducted a couple of years ago, decided to take a new approach. And we wanted to learn from the experts. We wanted to learn from people who inject drugs who've managed to avoid hepatitis C. And this drew on a positive deviance approach, which had its basis in childhood malnutrition studies. So here, in respect to childhood malnutrition, the interest was on the child that was doing well in a context of widespread malnutrition. What helped these children stay healthy? So we wanted to focus on the protective individual, social and environmental factors, and in doing this we took a broad view. So I conducted life history interviews, multiple life history interviews with people who injected drugs, de-emphasising risk, de-emphasising hepatitis C, just seeing what came up. So this is an example of a second life history timeline that I'd make up. I did a first life history timeline. We just drew it out, did it together. It was a co-constructed thing. Then I'd go away on a computer, draw up this, take it back to the person, and we would talk about their life looking at the timeline. And it was a really wonderful process because people loved to get this. You know, I'd make up several copies for them in colour, and they were really chuffed to have it to take away with them. So that was a nice aspect of the project too. Okay, so what did we find? Now, there were many protective practices, and in themselves, these aren't necessarily surprising. Certainly things like separating and marking needles and syringes and equipment, having rules about not sharing, using alone, waiting to use to at home, etc., are not particularly surprising in themselves. But what was interesting was what motivated these practices. So this is what I'm going to talk about is that, you know, not sharing or reusing needles and syringes is often motivated by concerns around vein care, by facilitating a quick, pleasurable, easy injection, by concerns around image management, wanting to avoid track marks, wanting to avoid being seen as an injecting drug user. And you know, having an easy injection means it's a pleasurable injection. But, you know, there's nothing worse than digging around trying to find a vein, getting blood all over the place and increasing despair. You know, people want to maximise their injecting experience. So using new needles was often about that. Again, using it alone and at home was again about pleasure and privacy, wanting to get home, not wanting to be hassled by anybody, wanting to just be able to relax and enjoy the hit. You know, this is obviously an overdose concern, but in terms of hepatitis C, it's protective. Preparedness was about avoiding withdrawal, alternating smoking and injecting, again avoiding withdrawal, which is about, you know, maximising pleasure, not wanting to experience the pain and discomfort of withdrawals. And so I'm going to give you some examples of these. Right, I've written a paper on this. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to send it to you. But for me, this was a really interesting finding. A lot of these guys I spoke to, and women as well, have been injecting for over 20 years. A lot of them started injecting before they'd heard of hepatitis C, and actually hepatitis C awareness is very late amongst this group of people anyway. But HIV didn't even figure a lot for them. But the main reason that they decided that they wanted to not share, to use new needles, was in terms of their capacity, their sharpness, you know, their utility in getting a quick, pleasurable hit, rather than in terms of their sterility. So as Andy here says, I'm not going to use a pin needle more than once. Once it's punctured my skin twice, that pin is dead now because it's blunt. Therefore, I can't share anyone else's because it's blunt already. That was one of the reasons, that's the main reason. Jeff, if you always use fresh needles, you minimise any vein damage. I do it to look after my veins, to get more usage out of them. So these narratives are really interesting, especially in an environment where people are exhorted not to share to avoid bloodborne viruses. People were telling me a very different story indeed. And Giles, here's a service user rep, he said, people would rather use clean works because they're sharp for a start. So you know they're not going to be blunt. But does the message get through? Because Hep C, you know, yeah, Hep C, so what? I'm not going to drop down dead tomorrow. So this spoke to the temporal orientation of many people who use drugs, which is often necessarily present orientated. It's about getting your drugs, avoiding withdrawal, getting money, getting a place to stay for the night, avoiding imprisonment, dealing with you know, issues in social relationships, rather than necessarily thinking or concentrating on something that might affect them in 15 or so years. And this is the way that people talk about hepatitis C to me. Oh, it might affect me in 10, 15 years, or, so that the concerns are very much necessarily present orientated. Another protective factor was taking charge of your own injecting, mixing up your own mix, giving yourself your own hit and things like this. Now, this is obviously protective for bloodborne viruses, yet again, the motivation was about a pleasurable injecting experience. So Rebecca and Abby here have both had experiences of nasty hits, and this is why they kept their stuff clean. So Abby here says, I had a dirty hit once before, you get a great big pounding headache, go all shivery, and it's horrible, really horrible. So it was just from that I knew to keep my shit clean. Not from any of all the harm reduction stuff saying, keep your shit clean so you don't get bloodborne viruses. No, it's about having a dirty hit and the unpleasantness that entails. And again, Rebecca, she didn't want other people to be cooking up her gear because they put too much citric in it and it would burn. Now, another protective practice involved the personal stockpiling of methadone. Now, stockpiled methadone operated as a safeguard for many people in times of emergency. So as Jeff here says, I keep a stash of methadone up there at my dad's. It's there for emergencies. So this is when people missed a pickup at their chemist. They might have got cut off unexpectedly for some minor infraction, as often may happen. They may not be able to get any gear, etc. Having a stockpile bit of methadone there really helped them out. Tom, again, he was very strategic about this. He says, if I was going to be out on the road, I made sure I had methadone, so thank goodness I was never put in a position where I was really, really sick with heroin and no syringes. Now, many of these people had few financial resources, and stockpile methadone also helped as a way of cementing social relationships. It was a way to give and provide and help others who are also in need. And this was also protective for the individual, because if you help out your mate when they're hanging out, when they're in withdrawal, they don't have any gear, then when it's your turn, they're more likely to help you out. So as Sally here says, leftovers I was giving away, people helped me out too, so this is about that. Now, structural constraints impeded the ability to take part in some of these protective practices. So, for example, all of the people that were able to stockpile methadone and keep it as a safeguard received methadone takeaways. People under supervised consumption were not able to do this, so were more vulnerable when there was risk. So as Colin says, if you take it in the chemist, you've got to do it all at once. You're not allowed to save any, you have to drink it all. So we wrote about this in a paper called Methadone Diversion as a Protective Strategy, the Harm Reduction Potential of Generous Constraints. Now this was somewhat contentious, especially in a policy environment which is cutting down on people's methadone takeaways, which is encouraging people to come off methadone, and where the dominant narrative is around risk. Risk of death, risk of, here you've got headlines, of manslaughter, cycle of death and misery caused by black market methadone, and it's all funded by the taxpayer. This is the dominant narrative. So our findings showed something else. These narratives of risk don't necessarily speak to the everyday realities of people who are injecting drugs. We found that stockpiled methadone for many operated as a safeguard and enabled the cementing of social relationships. So it was nice to be able to put that out there. So what about risk? Obviously not everybody was always safe, and there were many times when people did engage in risky injecting practices. Now this is a very broad heuristic. There's a lot of overlap between individual, situational and structural. If anyone wants these slides, I'm happy to send them to you, so I'm not going to go over this, but just give some examples. So transmission knowledge was a big one, particularly around sex. A lot of people in long-term relationships don't use condoms. This is whether you're an injecting drug user or not, right? And so a lot of the people I spoke to were in relationships, weren't using condoms. They thought, well, Hep C is sexually transmitted, I'm going to get it anyway, so we might as well share needles and syringes. Now this is a huge risk because hepatitis C, especially in, when there's non-traumatic sex, when people don't have HIV, is very hard to get sexually. But here people were putting themselves at risk unnecessarily by sharing needles. People often went into extreme periods of risky behaviour after a traumatic event in their lives, and this may include having their children taken away. And as Tom says here, after his mother died, he says, things got really crazy and intense, I was suicidal, usually of such excess I didn't really care. The ability to prepare and administer drugs is a big thing, and this is especially pertinent for women who may be relying on their partners or other people to mix up the drugs and to inject them, therefore putting themselves in unnecessary risk. Again, we know that if you're in withdrawal, you're much more likely to be in a risky injecting situation. So, and this is particularly the case if there's not a place nearby where you can get clean gear. So as Ruben says, if you're ill and you got no clean pins and the chemist is 10 miles away, you ain't going to fucking go to the chemist. Bollocks, just give me a pin, I'll use it. I have to get better, thank you. And again, this is speaking to the immediate, the need to, counter that withdrawal, to get well, rather than some long-term consequence that may come from that. Relationship and power dynamics are especially acute, and again I think this is particularly the case for women who inject drugs. So Helene says, he said to me when he went out, when he goes out at 10 o'clock in the morning, I'll be back in 2.5 hours. He doesn't get back till 10 p.m. I'll come back with works, he don't come back with nothing. He did come back with drugs, but no clean gear. No clean works. Helene had been waiting all day for him to come back. I asked her why she didn't just go out and get it herself, but for some reason that there wasn't the capacity there. And I think that has to do with power dynamics and relationships. Okay, needle and syringe program location is a big one. And I think this is a real issue in the UK where needles and syringes are primarily provided at pharmacies and in drug and alcohol settings. So people spoke to me about not wanting to get needles and syringes from pharmacies if they're receiving their methadone from there because it might be used as a reason not to dispense the methadone, not wanting to get needles and syringes from drug and alcohol clinics because their caseworker might know, they're telling their caseworker they're not injecting. And I mean, this is particularly the case in this current recovery environment where people be encouraged to, stop injecting, get off the methadone, all the rest. So Colin here illustrates that well. Stigma, child removal policies and mistrust of services is another huge barrier for people entering services, accessing and injecting equipment, and again this is particularly for women. As Abby says, the women suffer in silence, they just buy methadone on the street, do what they can to survive. And then there's the fear if they've got kids, that's one of the big issues, it's their kids. So what can harm reduction do to attend to these issues? I believe that harm reduction needs to pay more attention to the pleasures and pragmatics of using, of safe and injecting risk situations. Pragmatic interventions can include standalone and peer-engaged needle and syringe programs. They have these in Australia and New Zealand with great success, but I haven't seen many in the UK. There needs to be couple-based information and equipment, and information and advice that incorporates acknowledgement of unprotected sex, instead of just adding on safe sex information because it's a good thing to do. This is not, it's not a good idea. It's like, yeah, sure, you're not using condoms, right, that's fine. What else can how can you keep safe? Also packs for couples, his and hers coloured needles and sin bins, so that when people do have to share, they're not reaching into the same sin bin and trying to work out whose is whose, but it's easy for people to distinguish. And injecting supplies, as you can see, do a great job of providing coloured needles. Flexible methadone provision, I'm all for encouraging takeaways. Attention to pressing needs, housing, acute health problems and vein care. This is what people care about. And this is a good way to engage people with services. An illustration of this is I was interviewing Helene. I interviewed her twice. We were just talking completely unexpectedly. She stood up, whipped off her pants, showed me her groin injecting holes and said, sometimes I just can't get the femoral vein. Look, I got 2 fingers here. Can you tell me where the best place is to go? And I was like, whoa. I said, well, I'm not a medical doctor and I never used to inject in the groin. So I couldn't give her proper advice, but we'd build up a rapport. She trusted me. She was able to ask me, and to me this speaks to a real lack of places that people can go to ask for safe injecting advice, especially in this recovery climate where people are being encouraged to stop using. There's a real unmet need here. I think that community empowerment is really important, and this is not to be on a tokenistic way, but meaningful, paid and trained peer involvement in service design and provision. There is a need for community-generated and gender-specific programs that empower people who inject drugs to take charge of drug and equipment acquisition, drug mix and injecting. And here, programs aimed at women would be nice, show them how to mix up safely, tell them where to go, things like that. Also to address the traumas that can lead to periods of devolution, to help people get through things like having their children taken away without going off the rails. So there's a really nice program here in Canada. The Grief and Loss Education Action Project engages women who are past or current drug users and who have had children apprehended by social services in the sharing of lived experiences, coping strategies, art making and action planning to work towards creating a transformed child welfare system. Group members have participated in several public speaking engagements. Now this may look a world away from hepatitis C, what's it got to do with it? But I actually believe that helping people address their needs, their most pragmatic needs, and helping them overcome periods of great trauma, such as having children taken away, empowering them to change the system, can have many beneficial onward effects, such as being more engaged, caring more, being able to take more charge of their house, not being in despair, being able to engage with services, feeling more empowered generally. And is there a place for pleasure? Is there a place for pleasure in harm reduction? Rick here says, I loved gear. It weren't a necessity. I right enjoyed it. That's the truth of the matter. You can go months in rehab and you don't hear people say how much they enjoyed it. Do you know what I mean? This is not a discourse we hear. Do we hear harm reduction speaking to this rationality? Also, do we hear harm reduction speaking to the different conceptions of risk that people have? So, I believe that risk is a relative, temporal and situated concern. Tony here told me about a practice that he had. Tony, with a group of mates, this was a little while ago, he called it the National Lottery, and I also spoke to a friend of his who told me about the National Lottery. They would get a big sin bin, needles in it from countless people, empty it onto the ground, each one would choose a needle. Tony here talks about his preference in terms of the National Lottery. He said, if you're lucky, you might have HIV, but it would be a sharp pin, because you could end up with a fucking blunt one. So it's kind of better to have a sharp one with HIV rather than a blunt one with nothing. Now, people may find that shocking. People may see this as an example of people who inject drugs not caring, being irresponsible. But there is a rationality here. It's just more present orientated. And do harm reduction messages speak to these different rationalities? So here's some advertising based at men who have sex with men, which incorporates pleasure much more than I see messages addressed at people who inject drugs. So you've got this big smiling guy here with his PrEP pill. Here you have the message, you have the power, enjoy your freedom, have fun safely. Do we see messages addressed at people who inject drugs about using clean needles saying have fun? I haven't seen any. So because we published some of this work, Tim Bingham from the Irish Needle Exchange Forum put together some harm reduction posters based on the messages from the Staying Safe project, which looked at different reasons why people may want to use clean works. And here these were about the vein care messages. So it was really nice, it was really gratifying for me to see this having some sort of practical impact, that our research findings were taken up by people on the ground, with no impetus from us, but this was a thing that happened in parallel. So in conclusion, I believe that Hep C avoidance can be an indirect effect of short-term concerns. By this I mean the direct effect is wanting to get a pleasurable, quick, easy hit, maintain veins, etc. The indirect effect is avoiding hepatitis C and bloodborne viruses. We need therefore to harness pleasures and pragmatics in harm reduction. Risks are often due to risky environments. We need also to think about enabling environment interventions. I believe it's very important for community empowerment because then people can feel ownership of programs and be more engaged. And is there a place for the pleasures and pragmatics of drug use in a recovery agenda? or will they forever remain the elephant in the room? You know, do messages, speak to people like Malcolm, who says, I like taking drugs, you know, I'm going to continue taking them until I die. And, you know, I thought Tim Bingham's don't really emphasise the pleasure enough. So there you go, that's my version. You know, it would have looked better if the syringe was out, but it's got to be safe, right? So it's got to be in its wrapper. Okay, thank you very much.